Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. As usual, we're going to look at an item description here, but this one's actually part of a series we've slowly been examining. Deathblood of Kin. Deathblood of the inhuman kin who are connected with the higher rank ones. Gain indescribable dying wills of blood through use. What lies ahead is beyond humanity, the holy mystery once witnessed at Byrgenwerth. And not only is this the next step in the progression of Coldblood or Deathblood items, it also connects with a number of ongoing terms we've been looking at. First of all, here we're seeing the use of the term Shimpi again in the Japanese. This time it's been translated as Eldritch Truth, as it was on the Lake Rune, Graveguard set, and the Augur of Ebrietas, as opposed to the Gift of the Godhead, as we saw in the last episode. This is an interesting point, but one that we'll have to revisit in a future episode, since there are still some important revelations ahead. On a related note, here we're also seeing that same kanji written out that got us plunged into the swamp in the last episode. This could be interpreted to mean either that this Eldritch Truth or Holy Mystery was seen at Byrgenwerth, or that people came into its presence there. My more literal translation has gone with witnessed, but I actually think the have audience with meaning more likely in this scenario. So I'm happy to see the translation employ the phrase touched upon. This manages to be remarkably vague while also hinting at discovery, which is highly appropriate for the school of Byrgenwerth. The other thing I really like about this translation is the tone it establishes in setting up the turn towards cosmic horror, and I think looking at the progression of Coldblood items helps drive this home. The most basic variety come from any old beast, the next tier up is the product of obsession, then comes the manifestation of madness, and now we've ascended beyond humanity. There's even a potential reference being made in the Japanese to the translated title of one of Lovecraft's stories. Apparently, the short story The Unnameable was called Meijo Shigatai Mono in Japan, and in the Japanese item description, this dying will is referred to as Meijo Shigatai. Of course, unnameable blood echoes doesn't make much sense in English, but I do like the play on unspeakable here, because while it matches the literal Japanese meaning of indescribable, it also gives the term a connotation of intense horror. There's even another potential allusion to Lovecraft in The Eldritch Truth, but again, we'll come back to that. For now, let's move on. Executioner's Gloves. One of the secret treasures in the possession of Cainhurst. The gloves of an executioner from a distant land. Passed down for generations in the executioner's family, these must have been stained with an incalculable amount of blood. Now they are the dwelling place of countless vengeful spirits, with blood being the catalyst to summon them. The nobles were fond of these, and are said to have enjoyed the mad dancing of the vengeful spirits. This, I think you'll agree, is a mostly straightforward translation, with the notable exception of one or two lines in the middle. One of these changes strikes me as entirely in line with the original, that is, the difference in wording between these gloves being passed from executioner father to executioner son, as opposed to them being passed down for generations in the executioner's family. Clearly both of these phrasings get at the same idea, and the official translation is both shorter and in some sense clearer here, since it also emphasizes the idea that the gloves were made use of by each successive generation. The other change is more noticeable, as it involves some loss of information. You may have noted that my more literal version points out that these gloves likely accumulated a lot of blood across those generations of use, and that countless vengeful spirits dwell within them. The official version, on the other hand, notes only that wrathful spirits of the past can be summoned by smearing them with blood. This isn't an entirely trivial bit of information loss either, because these are lines that reinforce the idea of how the will of the slain lingers in blood in the world of Bloodborne. In the Japanese, it is heavily implied that it is because these gloves have become so soaked with blood that the spirits of the dead are able to adhere within them. In a way, it suggests to me that this is another form that blood echoes, or the dying wills of blood, can be expressed. Even if they're not channeled into the strength of a hunter tied to the dream, some part of those who die lives on in the blood they leave behind, and with enough of it over a long enough period of time, they can be called upon by the animating power of more blood. That said, I don't want to overstate the importance of this information either. Even without the game spelling out that gloves used across generations of executioners have likely been exposed to a lot of blood, I think most players will be able to come to the conclusion that the wrathful spirits the gloves summon are related to the executions. Given that this is Bloodborne, it wouldn't even be unreasonable for them to speculate that the blood of the dead is what makes this possible, and leaving room for players to speculate is important in these games. So, while I do think the official English loses something by not including this information, it also doesn't strike me as the most important set of lines to retain. What this all boils down to is that I suspect this discrepancy is the result of some strict character and line limitations. Of course, as I've said before, this kind of speculation is risky. There are many reasons that information might be missing in the official English as opposed to the Japanese. We've seen the Japanese text apparently get updated while the corresponding English is not. We've seen what appear to be more accurate English translations go unused in favor of other ones also on the disc. And I've talked before about how I have a hard time making sense of the character and line limits used for item descriptions. Sometimes the information I piece together feels like it's leading somewhere, only for contradictions to emerge upon further examination. For instance, I mentioned before that I thought the Shaman Boneblade felt like its English version was being shortened to fit some tight character limits. A quick check in Word let me know it consisted of 340 characters over 8 lines. These Executioner's gloves also feel to me like they had to sacrifice some information to fit these limits, and they come out to 340 characters over 9 lines. More recently, I mentioned I had similar suspicions about the repercussions, which I have as 356 characters over 9 lines. This all feels like it might be pointing towards a reasonable set of limits, right? And using an admittedly liberal estimate of what the line limits might be, my literal version of the Executioner's gloves clocks in at about 436 characters over 10 lines. But consider the numbers my word analysis gets me on an item we haven't looked at in detail yet, the Beak Mask from Eileen's set. It's 453 characters over 11 lines. Also of note, look at how on the Beak Mask the characters generally go all the way to the end of their respective lines. This is in stark contrast with the Executioner's gloves, where all the lines end short. It's tempting to conclude then that the limit on the characters per line was expanded at some point, but both the Shaman Boneblade and the repercussions also have lines that extend basically all the way to the edge. Which is a long way of saying I'm still not sure how to reverse engineer these character and line limits, though I remain suspicious that they were initially rather tight and expanded over time. That might explain why some of the information in the Executioner's gloves was dropped. But I think that's more than enough speculation on that point. Let's switch over to another item. Cain Verification. Proof of being one of the Royal Guard, who protect Annalise, Cainhurst's Queen of Blood. They are above all hunters of blood, hunting prey in search of blood impurity. Whether one willingly becomes that way also, or simply borrows that power, depends on the holder of the verification. So, this item is actually the first in a small group of items related to Annalise's Royal Guards, which all have a peculiar naming convention in the Japanese. You may have noticed right as I started reading my literal translation that though in the official English this is called the Cainhurst Badge, the Japanese only spells out the first part of the word, so this is literally the Cain Badge. We'll see this again when we look at the garb worn by the Royal Guard, and taken together these disparate items have me thinking that maybe this wasn't either a typo or an abbreviation in the Japanese, but a deliberate term. I have to wonder if perhaps the Cains of Cainhurst is what the members of the Cainhurst Royal Guard were called. It also happens to draw my attention to a bit of lore from another game related to vampires. In Vampire the Masquerade, Cain from the biblical tale of Cain and Abel is considered the first vampire. But the parallels to Bloodborne do not end there. Apparently, in the mythos of Vampire the Masquerade, Cain only becomes a vampire after Lilith, Adam's first wife in this mythology, performs a ceremony of awakening which involves him drinking her blood. Cain is then visited by 3 angels and given the chance to repent for his murder of Abel. He rejects each one and is thus cursed 3 times over. He and his children become weak to fire, vulnerable to sunlight, and subject to the beast within, which hungers for blood. Again, this is sounding a lot like how a hunter drinks the blood of a queen despised by the healing church and is tasked with hunting after blood and its impurities. Of course, this could all be nothing. There's a certain amount of this that would fit any vampire story, and I have no idea if the designers at From Software even know about Vampire the Masquerade. but it's a connection that just leapt out at me as soon as I saw that this badge of Queen Annalise's royal guards is technically called the Cain Badge in Japanese. In fact, it may be that the reason all of these Cain items were rendered Cainhurst items instead was because the translators were aware of this spurious connection and decided to steer away from it. But this also falls in line with something of a general trend we've seen with references to Vilebloods or Cainhurst. There's a good amount of diversity in the Japanese phrasing that's being smoothed out in the translation. This is clearer with the term Vileblood, where we've already seen the Japanese terms Ketsuzoku and Keigareta Ketsuzoku, both rendered Vileblood, but there are a few other recent examples of this as well. Back when our character was speaking with Annalise, the prompt that appears for us to swear the oath and become one of her blood relations actually uses another variation. Literally, the Japanese text here is something more like, perform the oath of blood, while the official translation is, swear Vileblood oath. And this treatment of the phrase of blood as synonymous with Vileblood is also present in the Cainhurst Badge itself. You might have caught the fact that while the official translation speaks of Vileblood Queen Annalise, my more literal version speaks of her as Cainhurst's Queen of Blood. Now, with character limits being what they are, I can see why the term Vileblood might recommend itself in both of these instances, especially in that small dialogue window provided for swearing the oath. And you may recall from previous episodes how I've addressed some of the considerations that may have gone into unifying the translation of Ketsuzoku and Keigareta Ketsuzoku. There are reasons for unifying these translations, just as there are for calling this Cain badge the Cainhurst Badge. But there are alternative reasons for providing some variety. For instance, treating the phrase Queen of Blood the same as Vileblood Queen might smooth over an important lore connection. But wait, because there's yet another possibility. What if the Japanese here is actually meant to be understood as Queen of the Blood of Cainhurst, which is another entirely valid interpretation of the phrase? This seems to tilt things back in the favor of unifying the term. Really, my point here is just that making these sorts of decisions can be difficult. There are easier items, though. Bud of a Deathblood Flower, one of the materials necessary for a holy chalice ritual. A pale plant that is said to bud in deathblood in abandoned places. Clearly, this is the most straightforward instance of translation for this episode. It's short, opens with some standard item phrasing that gets repeated throughout the chalice material items, and barring the discussion on cold blood versus death blood that we looked at in a previous episode, the official and literal texts are fairly similar. So what I'd like to highlight instead is one of the instances we can see here where the language has been tweaked just a bit in the official version to make it come across as more evocative. Literally, the end of this description says only that these plants bud in abandoned places, while in the official English we have a lengthier phrase, in a place long ago abandoned. Technically, this is a bit of extra information worked into the English that could theoretically have been from an older version of the item or something, but I don't think that's what's going on. The real impact I see from adding long ago doesn't have anything to do with the lore of how long a place needs to have been abandoned for a coldblood flower to bloom. It's about expressing atmosphere. This is another reason why I keep bringing up genre conventions about gothic horror, mentioning different themes of the game, and looking ahead to hints at cosmic horror. Presenting information so that it feels like it's in line with those themes and conventions goes a long way to conveying the core of a game to a player. Imagine if this line had been translated, bluish-white plants that sprout up out of deathblood in unused dumps. The information's still there, but the presentation doesn't feel like Bloodborne. This is one of the many problems with looking to a literal translation for everything, because even if you can present base information with it, personality, mood, and atmosphere all tend to suffer. Bloodborne, in my opinion, is excellent when it comes to conveying all of these things, and it's in part due to the use of phrasing like we can see here in a place long ago abandoned. It's not about the time frame, it's about the sense of sorrow and loss that comes with the idea of an old place once full of life that's now the site of death and oblivion. Or, to take things back to the Kin Coldblood that we opened the episode with, this is why phrases like, dare not to delve into the world beyond humanity, strike me as more effective than a literal, what lies ahead is beyond humanity. Phrasing this as a warning adds to the allure of forbidden knowledge and evokes the feeling that there are forces out there not meant to be tampered with. And in Bloodborne, that tone is important. which I think is a good point to end on. So please reach out if you have any feedback, and thanks for watching, everyone.